So just to start off, what is solutions journalism? So can you raise your hand if you heard of solution journalism before? Okay, so we've got quite a few people. So to give a bit of a recap, so solution journalism is rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. And so if we look into it in a bit more details, it covers a response to a problem and how it happened. And it also provides evidence of impact. So it's looking at effectiveness, not just intentions, and that's a really important aspect of solutions journalism. So if you have something that is, for example, like a pilot project or a theory or an idea, technically you can't have yet proof of impact or evidence, so it's not solutions journalism. So these evidence can be either qualitative or quantitative. And well, you might wonder, lots of times people are like, oh, you're just covering what's working then, but we also need to like acknowledge, that there are challenges. So actually solution journalism is also about the challenges. It's not about pretending everything is working. And if you have evidence showing that a response is not working, that's something that is a great solution journalism story. We are very keen on hearing about failed responses too, because we can learn from them. And solution journalism also produces insight that can help others respond. So looking at solutions that work in one place, then the idea is to see how these can scale to other places as well. And an important part of it is, as I mentioned, it's not just showcasing what's working and saying everything is perfect. It's very much as well pointing out any limitations or caveats of the response. So I wanted to showcase as well what solutions journalism is not, just to give you a bit of a better idea. So solution journalism is not hero worship. So you can see here on this headline, Miracle on the Ice, Doctor saves fellow hockey players' life during game. It's kind of like an uplifting headline, but technically that's all focusing on one person. It's not really focusing on what's happened or like what's the change that this person is making in that case. Whereas in solution journalism instead, the goal is to use characters to talk about systemic change. So here, for example, you can see this one. He survived Ebola. Now he's fighting to keep it from spreading. So the idea is that you can use one person as your key point for your story, but then you're really talking about the change that this person is actually making and how he or she is making it. It's also not a silver bullet. So, here you've got an example with, it's like a soccer ball that is indestructible. And so this article here, if you were to check it, is very much kind of like, you can see even here, sometimes a soccer ball is more than just a ball. Sometimes it's a lifesaver. So it's just kind of putting a solution as this brilliant silver bullet that will solve all problems. And actually, solutions journalism is a bit more nuanced. So instead, we are focusing on where the response does, but also doesn't work. And so the parallel for this story is this article, How Do You Make an Indestructible Soccer Ball? They look at how it's made, but they also looked at where it's working and not working. And for example, in there, they actually pointed out that this soccer ball is way more expensive than a regular one. So it makes it quite hard to scale because people just can't afford it. It's also not a favor for a friend. So in this one, you can see this is more of a PR piece. So it starts with like the idea was genius, and it's talking about the brand Tom's shoes. And so this is really all about, saying this brand is amazing, they're doing lots of great things, but you don't really have that objectivity. Whereas in solution journalism, you would focus on the pros and cons. So here you've got the equivalent article, which look at how it's working, but also looking at, how it might actually have some negative impacts. So both sides are really important. It's also not a theory. So as I mentioned earlier, you can't really do solution journalism on an idea or a theory or like a pilot that doesn't have any data yet. So in this case, this was a report looking at using the media to promote adolescent well-being. But it's very much a report saying this is a brief and this is, advocating how we can use social media, but there's no data yet because this is just a concept. And also, I just want to point it out, like all the examples that I'm showing that are on the left side, it's not to say they're not good example of journalism pieces. They're just not solutions journalism, but we need lots of different types of journalism. So it's not to say that they are bad or like anything like that. So in that case, instead of having these type of like more theoretical work, you would look at something that's already in process. And so that's how you would manage to have some data. So here you can see that was looking at how Iceland managed to kick teen drinking. And you're really looking at what it can teach to other places and looking at how it could be scaled. And in that case, for Iceland, they had lots and lots of data. So they could really use that as the strong basis for the article. It's also not meant to be an afterthought. It's really meant to be like front and center. So this was a story about the prison system in the US. And the thing is, it looked at the solution in the very last paragraph. So like, it was very much an afterthought of like, oh, we should just throw in some solutions at the end to show what's working in various places. But it wasn't the real key point focus of the piece. Whereas if you look on the other side, in Finland's open prisons, inmates have the keys. This is very clearly from the start a solutions piece. You know what to expect and you know it's going to be in there. It's also not activism. So you can see here this example from Canderel and how they launched a campaign to tackle food waste. So here it's very much, so this is the type of pages where, you would have like a donate button or a supporters button where you ask people to take action. Whereas in solution journalism, you're reporting on responses to problems, but you're not advocating for people to like do specific things. So here, for example, they're looking at how France became a global leader in curbing food waste, but they're not advocating people to like donate or support anything in particular. So the last important point about what solution journalism is not is it's not fluff. And lots of people think, oh, it's just all about like saving kitties and like this kind of like fluffy, uplifting news. And it's just not what it is. So, you can see an example here. A 9-year-old boy gave his teacher a $15 bonus to show his appreciation for all she does. It's a great story. It's cute. It's like, uplifting, but it is not solution journalism. So I just wanted to finish with showing you actually 2 examples from stories and kind of like breaking it down on how they're structured in terms of solutions journalism. So I didn't pick stories that are linked to the climate because I didn't want to start, putting any ideas in anyone's head. So I've taken a different topic instead. So this one is about a local transformation, and it's looking at how a struggling school for Native American doubled its graduation rate. And so basically the way you would break it down when you're working on a story for a solutions journalism piece is you would look first at what is the response. And here in that case, it's investing in culturally relevant curriculum and local leadership. So they've had new classes like indigenous language classes, tribal history, traditional literature, but they also had, so that was their response, but they had evidence of the fact that it had worked. So here they saw that the graduation rate had doubled, and they also had plus 65% of seniors enrolled in college. And so the insight here for other people would be that it's a framework that other Native communities potentially can follow and implement. And it's also in development in the works for 4 other schools. But as I mentioned, it's really important to look at any caveat or limitations. And so here the limitation is that it doesn't address all the issues that exist outside of the school system, such as alcoholism, high crime, etc. And if we end on looking at this one, so that's about the incarcerated support system. And so the response here, it's very much a nonprofit that invites formerly incarcerated people to mentor those living prison, and that happens within their first 72 hours of being out. So it provides them with a temporary home, with social services and support for starting a business. And so the evidence in this case, instead of being, we looked earlier at like quantitative data, this is more qualitative data. So it's from anecdotal evidence from like the graduates of the program. And then they use that to kind of bring the story to light. And the insight here is that it's a framework for how other communities with high incarcerations and poverty rates could adopt as well. And again, looking at the limitation here, it does not address larger systemic issues. So it's not looking into income inequality or racial injustice. So that's kind of like a brief overview of what solution journalism is and is not about. I will send you some link of resources after the workshop today. So Solutions Journalism Network has a great tool called the Solution Story Tracker. And so you can look in there to find solution stories on specific topic because there's like a search bar, which is really helpful. So let's say you wanted to say what's story are out there about climate change. You could go on there and type it and find stories. And they also have great training toolkits. So I will put all of that in the resources. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen now. And I think we're going to be able to move on. We've got 2 presentations. Martha, James, do you have a preference on who is starting first?
Well, mine's quite general, so it might be worth my starting, and then Martha, if that's okay with you, Martha.
Sounds good to me. Yep.
Sounds good. So James is now going to give us a short presentation.
Can I just check that you are able to see? Okay, so what I'm going to do very quickly, I've only got 5 slides, is just give you an overview of what some of the academic and practical research says about climate change solutions in the media. I'm very conscious that there are a lot of eminent practitioners and researchers who know a lot about this material, but I was assuming that it would be helpful just to have a few prompts and a reminder of some of the context for the discussion. So just to start off with, I think it's true that at least a lot of the discussions that I've been participating in the past around the need for more stories and media coverage of climate solutions has been partly driven by the view that, expressed very simply, if only we could get more inspiring stories and solutions into the media and move away from the doom and gloom dominant narrative, then that would help enormously in terms of audience behavior change and participation around finding solutions. And I think that was for many years the dominant view. But there are many people on this call who will know that it's actually a much more nuanced picture as to how stories and visuals land on different audiences. And I'm sorry to repeat what is very commonly known now in the literature, but we all process information about climate change through a prism of our political beliefs, our cultural affinities, and other issues. So the way that certain stories, even very positive stories, might land with different groups is actually very nuanced and very complicated. So the idea that, you know, just put out lots of climate solution stories and this is going to solve the problem, no, it's much more nuanced than that. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that later. And Josh is on this call, and Toby and others know a lot more about it. But I think it's a very important contextualization to the discussion. So very briefly, what does the media research show? So historically, there's a lot of work shown that climate journalism did dwell much more and cover much more what I would call the negative impacts and the doom and gloom stories, rather than positive stories of opportunities. I've put in brackets a lot of the references. If people are interested, I'm very, very happy to share them. I think that was probably true in the past, and I'll say in a minute why I think it's changed. But for example, if you look at the IPCC reports, and we've done a lot of work around that, the media, for example, the media coverage of AR4, we calculated that about 80 to 90% of the stories around those reports, even though there was quite a lot of content on solutions, that 80% was doom and gloom, and only 2% were talking about renewable energy. But this was sort of, you know, quite some time ago. I think this is interesting. There's also been research showing that when you do read stories in the media or see reports, that climate change impacts and action tend to be discussed separately. They don't tend to come together. So there's this view that, you know, you go to the doctor and you say what the problem is, but you don't get the solution at the same time. In that study I quote there, I think it was only like 30% of stories, this was from the US, up until about 2014, actually both discussed the problem and the solutions at the same time. And then about adaptation stories, but I think it has probably changed a little. There's been some work done by scholars in the US showing that only about 2% of stories are positive adaptation stories, that was again quite a dated study, but I think it is representative of what was happening certainly about 10 years ago. Then moving quickly on, I think there is some evidence for change. For those of you interested, there was a study that came out by Media Matters, an NGO group that monitors media, a lot about climate change just this month, showing that, as you can see in the slide, the amount of climate segments that actually discussed climate solutions, and I'll briefly just, I think there's a lot of ambiguity around what we mean by climate solutions. Actually, in any event, there was quite a big increase, nearly double since 2017 and 2018, on nightly, on television, and Sunday morning shows. And remember that in most countries, television is by far the most important and most trusted source of information about climate change. So studying television and news is really significant. We ourselves, second point, have done some work here in Oxford around the changing amount of coverage around the nexus between what we eat and climate change. So the whole role of agriculture in creating greenhouse gas emissions. Until very recently, that tended to be ignored in the media, but it's been a really distinct change in the last couple of years for all sorts of interesting reasons. It's much more about how a solution can be the individual one of eating less meat. And then there's many individual initiatives that have happened in the last couple of years. I noticed that Helen is here and Emily, they both have been involved in different initiatives around positive stories, but there's many other media organizations. If you want the links, I'm very happy to share it. Washington Post did an initiative called Climate Solutions. The Guardian, Vice, the excellent Environment Journalist Network have all done a huge amount in the last couple of years on more climate solutions. So moving rapidly on, I'm sure we'll discuss this, but in the literature, at any rate, there's quite a lot of ambiguity about what, when we say climate solutions, and I know Julia's just given a very detailed description of what she understands by the word, the concept of solutions journalism. In the discussion, the literature, I think it's interesting, there's a lot of, it's a sort of catch-all phrase, from everything to taking action and activism, discussions about adaptation, mitigation, local level initiatives or national level policies. There's evidence from some of the literature that journalists are much more in favor of soft path versus hard path energy solutions. By hard path, I mean nuclear or geoengineering compared to wind or solar. But I do think in discussing climate solutions, it's quite helpful to say, what are we actually talking about here? And what's the evidence from the literature and from the social psychologists about what works and what doesn't work when you're receiving information about these different areas, this vast scope of options for climate solutions journalism in terms of content. Then finally, I think in any discussion about climate solutions journalism, we do have to remember a number of key points about the general context. When we're talking about the media, obviously we all know that it's changing very, very rapidly. Do we mean social media? Do we include social media? Because that's, as we know from the Reuters Institute digital news reports, it's a very, very common platform now for getting information. And there are changing very different country-specific contexts. The way that climate solutions journalism plays out in Latin America might be very, very different from the UK or the US. Third point, there's several new initiatives, including targeting youth audiences. I hope Helen and others talk about them with some fascinating insights of what can and doesn't work. And then, of course, this huge issue that is beginning to surface in the sort of blogosphere and chattering commentariat about the implications of climate journalism in a post-corona world, which I don't think we can ignore in any discussion around climate solutions journalism. So I would stress that, you know, this is a very rapidly changing media environment and societal environment in which these discussions have to take place, and we'd be foolish not to try and get a handle on some of it. So that's all I was going to say. I've got masses of links to examples of climate solutions journalism if you're interested, and the literature, and I'm very happy to share it. And I should have said, sorry, do interrupt if you don't understand anything or I'm going too fast, but I thought at least that would be a snapshot of some of what the academic research tells us about solutions journalism in the climate sphere.
Amazing, thank you so much. I think people are very keen on having a copy of your slides. So if you're happy for that to be shared, feel free to send them to me and I'll pass them around.
And I'll try and write up I'll put the references in a slide as well.
Brilliant. Does anyone have any burning question for James before we move to Martha's presentation? Okay, I think Martha, then that's your turn.
Great. Yeah, so I'm editor of BBC Future Planet, and we are a new environmental solutions feature site on bbc.com, which is the international arm of the BBC website. And so we are quite new. We were born in February. So it's been an interesting first couple of months to start looking at environmental solutions, particularly now in the context of coronavirus. And so the Future Planet site was sort of born out of several sort of different motivations. So one is about a desire to connect with younger audiences, because of sort of a lot of research showing that environment and particularly climate change are at the top of younger audiences' interest. And also to expand our reach sort of geographically with global audiences. Yeah, so part of that, and I think it's really interesting thinking a little bit about what we sort of understand by solutions journalism. And I think the summary that Julia gave was really interesting, because we all have a sort of instinctive idea of what it is, but to have it sort of laid out so kind of analytically is really useful. And I think also James's point on what we understand by it differently, particularly in sort of different international contexts, is really interesting. And that's something that we focus on a lot at Future Planet. So one thing I'll say as well that sort of has just sort of struck me this morning is, someone with a background in science journalism, is that good solutions journalism seems to take many of the tenets of good science journalism in terms of dwelling on sort of rigorous analysis of empirical evidence and careful contextualization and acknowledgement of limitations. So one thing that I'll add to that from our perspective is sort of what makes good solutions journalism is having a sort of really global approach to it, particularly when it comes to environment and climate change. So the way that we do that is by working with a sort of expanding network of global writers. So we have sort of very talented, we mostly work with freelance journalists as well as colleagues within the BBC, based all around the world on sort of all continents. And the reason that we do that is to try and surface local voices who have first-hand experiences of these solutions, of their impact, of the ones that do work and the ones that don't work. Because I think it's very important not just to focus on the global picture, but to work with global writers, because the sort of the stories that you get are sort of a step change in difference compared with if you have perhaps someone who isn't, you know, kind of parachuted into that community, which obviously we can't do at the moment anyway because of coronavirus. Yeah, so we just try to sort of integrate that global picture into solutions to make sure that we're kind of assessing them in the most kind of grounded and realistic way. And so we also think part of solutions journalism is about thinking about our own practices as journalists. So again, in line with our approach of taking a very global picture and working with global writers, we don't like to parachute journalists into, say, for example, a story in Botswana. We would look for someone who, you know, has been living in that community, perhaps sort of born and raised in that community, who can give us a realistic picture. And of course, one kind of joint benefit of that is that we keep an eye on our sort of carbon emissions, and we keep them to as low as possible. So we prioritize on the ground journalism, you know, sort of reporting from location over-desk journalism when we're not in lockdown. So that has the joint benefit of keeping our carbon footprint down in terms of travel, and then we also trying to think about our digital carbon footprint as well, and the ways that we can sort of reduce our digital emissions too, as part of a wider effort within the BBC and also other media organisations. And then also in terms of our own practices, we also try to have good practice in terms of the visuals that we use, because that's a huge part, obviously, of sort of, grounded climate journalism. So we've, been very interested in the work by kind of climate visuals and try to build an aesthetic that complements the coverage that we're doing. And also, considering aspects of our business model as well, and how that can be conducive to solutions journalism as well. So then I suppose the last thing that I'll say is that we very much take an integrated approach to solutions. So we try not to focus too much on, for example, a technological solution without also thinking about the social context, the economic context, and so on, because of so much sense that's lost if you don't kind of take a 360 picture of solutions and how they work on the ground. So that also means, we're an environment solutions site, so not just climate solutions. So that means also looking at solutions, it could be a climate solution, but also thinking about it in the context of, habitat, land use, environmental degradation as well. So we try to sort of, take a sort of a big picture view and focusing very much on sort of systemic change rather than individual. So so that's my sort of cap of where we are at the moment with Future Planet.
Thank you so much. That's really exciting to hear, actually. And in terms of like having coverage from the ground, it's something that we were really happy at Inkline to get the Solution Journalism Network grant, actually, because it's allowed us to call for pitches out there and to get people from the places we wanted to get reports from to actually write them. So that's something that is definitely making quite a difference. Does anyone have questions for Martha before we moved on to the next part of the workshop?
Yeah, is there any sense that your program will be revived? Is there a timetable? I know it's really difficult at the moment.
So we're a digital feature site, so we don't we're not broadcast, so we haven't been kind of put on hold with coronavirus. Okay. We're still publishing, obviously having to sort of pivot our coverage in the light of coronavirus, but as I'm sure we'll be talking about later, there's such huge overlap between the climate crisis and coronavirus and broader environmental issues that we've thankfully been able to carry on throughout.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, both James and Martha, for your presentations. That's definitely really interesting to hear both of these perspectives.